Good morning to one and all present here today. Honorable Director of SPA Vijayawada, Professor Dr. Meenakshi Jain ma'am, our guest speaker for the day, Professor Vinayak Bharne sir, Architect Poonam Verma ma'am, Senate members, respected deans, head of department, faculties and students. On behalf of SPA Vijayawada, Department of Architecture, I, Shivani Singh, a student of BARC 4th year, would like to welcome you all to the special lecture of Knowledge Series and introduce today's guest speaker, Professor Vinayak Bharne sir, for as part of the guest lecture for the students of architecture and planning on the topic Heritage Conservation and Urbanism, Notes from 2 decades of Practice. Vinayak Bharne sir is an urban design and city planning practitioner and educator based in Los Angeles. He is the principal and director of design of Mole and Polozoid Architects and Urbanists, adjunct associate professor of urbanism at the University of Southern California, and director of the India-Netherlands-based think tank, My Livable City. His projects have received several awards, including the National Award for Smart Growth, Overall Excellence from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and the Excellence in Planning Implementation Award from the American Institute of Planners. Profiled as an emerging thought leader by the World Architecture News in 2013, Sir was awarded the Urban Edge Award for Excellence in the field of urban design in 2015, and he was also recipient of the Marshall School of Business Presidential Fellowship in 1997. We are very eager and enthusiastic to hear you online today, sir. Thank you for considering our invitation. We really look forward to hearing you on this subject today. Now, I would request our Honorable Head of Department, Dr. Janmajoy Gupta, sir, to share his views for the day and address the audience.
Yeah, warm good morning to everyone, especially to Vinayak Bharne sir. We are privileged to have you here, really, truly. I extend my greetings to Poonam Verma ma'am, to our director ma'am, to my fellow faculty members here at SPA Vijayawada. It's indeed been an enriching experience hearing different viewpoints as we have heard over the last few weeks in the course of this knowledge series. It's really a privilege to have you, sir, here today. And as Shivani, our 4th year student, quite nicely introduced you, I can further add that it's a new perspective that we are going to get to know in the next 2 hours, in which how urban design, city planning, and conservation come together, and how the heritage, conservation, and urbanism can be synced together to offer a holistic viewpoint with respect to a lot of other surrounding issues that surround our built environment, like sociological issues, ecological issues, and even issues like climate change. So it's really, I am looking forward to this next 2 hours, and I hand it over to Vinayak sir to take it over. Yeah. Sir, please.
Well, thank you. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes, sir, you are
All right,
clearly.
very good. Well, thank you first of all to SPA. You know, you're an institution of great repute in India, so this is not a lecture I take lightly, and it's also a double the pleasure because the invitation came from a very good friend of mine, Poonam Verma Mascarenhas, who's a person I hold in high regard, not just as a friend, but also as a professional, a very deep thinker, a great voice of conscience, an intellectual companion for me over the last few years. And I really very lucky to have someone like her in your Senate, and I'm looking forward to some very wonderful things through her in this collaboration with your school. So when I asked Poonam what she wanted me to speak about, particularly this is an address to students and faculty and perhaps some others who are joining us today, she said, well, this is really up to you and it's really about your work. So I thought I would reflect today on 2 decades of practice, which is really not too much of a time in the life of an architect. I mean, architects don't, if we don't, 2 decades of practice is a blink of an eye in practice of a career of an architect. But when you work with some intelligent people that you have the privilege of working with, and I would say, I've worked with some very intelligent people who've continued to inspire me and astound me. You learn a few things here and there. And I think these things are important to share because it's not rocket science and it's not anything that should be kept as a secret or anything. I think these these aspects need to be talked about, they need to be discussed, and that's the spirit with which I want to talk to you today candidly. So I thought I would talk today about practice. And the word practice, of course, if I've learned anything over the last 2 decades or more, it has been that practice is a term that we can define the way we want. Practice is a plural term. It is not a homogeneous fixed entity. It's filled with pluralism of all kinds. And this is a preface before I get into my slides. Practice, the first pluralism of practice is the practice of is the diversity of urban geography. I mean, when you're working all over the world, for example, the fact that you work in different cities that are administered differently, governed differently, the expectations, the regulatory stringency, the fact that cities change from place to place, countries change, nations, societies change from place to place, means that the way in which you practice changes. The conduits to bringing an effective urban change, architectural change, are not the same. So that's number one. So the process of practice changes. The second one is the pluralism of urban engagement. We practice in so many different ways. I have found that I myself, advertently, accidentally, or inadvertently, have practiced in so many different ways. I've practiced as a designer, trying to make projects and buildings and master plans. Sometimes you find yourself practicing as an activist, trying to give voice to the voiceless because you feel so strong about it. Sometimes you practice as an author because you want to advocate for positions that you don't get to do in mainstream practice because you're always at the mercy of clients or deadlines. Sometimes we practice as educators, excavating positions or creating propository ideas that we don't get to do because clients always limit things. You always work within the confines of limitations. My point is that I have found that practice is a muddle, a big mess of all kinds of endeavors which really have one or two constant things, at least for me. The first constant thing is that you're invested in the most profound critical issues of our times. I mean, I think that if you remove practice or the act of practice as an engagement, committed, responsible engagement to really tackling what you think are the most important challenges we are facing, then I'm not sure that I don't consider it to be sort of a consequential way of going about it. I mean, at least not for me. I felt that the joy of practice, the joy of being nourished by practice comes from the act of struggling with the most important issues. And in this journey of struggling with them, most of the time you don't hit the mark, you fail. But you get up and you try again, and you try again, and once in a while you hit the mark. And when you hit the mark occasionally, you learn so much that it really becomes part of your second nature. Because it has come through, it has not been given to you on a platter. The other point I want to make before I go into slides is everything I'm going to show you today, even maybe some books which have my name on the cover, I will confess that none of these things were done by me alone. This is very important because architects have a habit of being self-proclaimed heroes. We talk about projects as if we've done them on our own, as if we were the only torchbearers of these incredible things. I'm telling you that's not true. Every single thing I will show you today was collaborative. It was done as a messy collaboration between so many entities, so many disciplines, so many experts, whether they were books or projects or acts of activism, whatever it is, it was not me. So in that sense, you always, when you talk or you stand on a platform, you become a representative for so many other people who are behind the scenes that actually played such a crucial role in making it happen. So what I'm going to do is I'll show some of the work in a messy way, going through books and projects and all kinds of things, and talk to you about where we failed, what we learned, what we've struggled. I don't know how good of a job we did. That is not the point. The point is to share candidly the efforts that we were trying to do and perhaps the difference between what we intended and what came out of it. So I will share my screen now. I hope all this works well. I hope it will. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Very good. So I just want to begin by saying that we live now in a world which is unprecedented in terms of its time. I mean, I don't mean to be a kind of I don't mean to have the tone of an oracle or anything. I am not. But the fact is, we live in very strange times, not the least of which is the pandemic. Just the simple idea that something as simple as climate crisis, which has become a cliche, but the fact is that it's real, right? I mean, it's real. So, and one of the great issues that's causing this is urbanization. The dogmas of urbanization, the way we are thinking about urbanization, the petrified habits of urbanization. So I've always felt that if we in the architectural field, and when I say architectural, I'm talking of it in the architecture and the allied fields, landscape, heritage, everything, it's all one thing. If we don't consider ourselves environmentalists of sorts that are tackling this issue from the other side, then I don't know what the hell we are doing as professionals. So I know that Poonam and I are huge fans of David Attenborough, one of my heroes. And, if you think of what he's really been able to do, he's really been able to change the vantage point from which we look at ecology, from which we look at nature. He's been able to create global awareness about why this is important for us. I don't think that equivalent has happened for urbanization. If you think about it, so we try to preserve nature, we try to preserve ecology, but we destroy it on the other hand because the sort of petrified habits, the zoning, the codes, the regulations are destroying nature every day because cities are expanding. So unless we shift the vantage point as architects and say that is an issue that needs to be tackled with the utmost importance before we do anything else, I don't know what we're doing. That's number one. Second, I will say this categorically. I think the biggest tragedy we're facing right now is we have reduced the profession of architecture to an aesthetic field. It saddens the heck out of me. We judge architecture on aesthetics. I'm making this utterly simplistic, but I mean it. We get caught into aesthetics. We talk too much about aesthetics, which is really 25th on the list of what architecture should be. So there are many more critical issues that deserve far more attention in our field, and that is what I would like to draw your attention to. One of these is the issue of sprawl. Just think of how simple and tragic this is. You all know what sprawl is. If you don't, here's what it is. If you look at cities anywhere in the world, essentially there are two extremes in any city. Whether it's India or somewhere in the US or Europe, you have very high budget projects, very high budget agendas that make fantastic buildings, beautiful places that are wonderful. Then you have the other extreme, which is at the bottom right, which I don't have to tell you. I mean, in India, this is one of the greatest challenges we face. 1.2 billion people across the world do not have adequate shelter. 1.2 billion. That's incredible when you think about it. And then in the middle of every city is this mundane layer, which is where architects usually work. And this layer puts us at the mercy of all these forces. Freeways, suburbia, cars, malls, and zoning and codes and regulations that we have to adhere to. And at its very worst, this profession has become the slave of these attitudes because we try to find tricks of trying to get maximum FSI, trying to please our developer friends, etc., etc. But if you really think about it, this is a systemic problem because this is a self-destructive system that is eating itself up and in the process destroying our life every single day. We breathe toxic air. I don't have to tell you, I live in Los Angeles. We rely on the car. It takes us time to go from one place to the other. We don't find our daily needs within our walking distance. It just goes on and on and on. So how did we get to this place? I mean, if we're sensible architects that went to schools and studied and got degrees, even the greatest universities in the world, right, produced all these wonderful architects, how the hell did we get to landscapes like this where nothing is sustainable, nothing is ecologically meaningful? This is a toxic landscape. And the worst part is it even happens in the most regulated societies in the world. It's not happening by accident in some poor countries. This is happening in the most rich countries, the most regulated countries in the world, not as accidents, but as legal means. The sprawl is legal. I mean, just think of what I'm trying to say here. This is scary. Sprawl is a legal phenomenon that is happening because the rules, the laws that we have written are systematically allowing people to create landscapes like this that are self-destructive. So another way of saying it is, if we, as the purveyors of the built environment, as professionals who understand the built environment more than others, have the ability to reverse this, to gauge campaigns, to advocate for the reversal of this, that's incredible, right? It may be easier said than done in some societies than the other, but the process has to begin. So one of the things we have done in practice, at least in our practice, is we've really launched a campaign to talk about these things along with our colleagues. And the good news, this is a wonderful piece of news, is that for the first time, the whole idea of the architect with a capital A and round glasses and a black robe is passé. That's gone. I don't know when that ended. Thank God it ended. Because what's happening right now is municipalities in at least in the US, Europe, and hopefully in India as well, are waking up and recognizing that the way they've done planning, the way they've allowed architecture to come into the city, is not making anything more than individual buildings. So, at least in the US, what we've been able to do is collaborate as partners with the public sector. So you have the city and its officials, you have urban designers such as us and architects such as us collaborating along with other disciplines, landscape architects, etc., to create 20-year visions, 30-year strategic plans, 10-year strategic plans, not for little neighborhoods, but for entire cities. So here is a process, here is a project for a city called Montclair. A general plan is the largest policy document that the city has that will chart the means and the ways through which the city will create projects and implement its investment over the next 20, 30 years. So this is an urban design vision citywide, and I don't want to get into details, but the point I'm trying to make is it keeps certain aspects of the city intact. It talks about a green armature for the city. It prioritizes the projects, and actually really begins this idea by telling the city that private development is not the way to begin, right? If you want to transform a city, private development is difficult because it relies on private developers, private money, etc., etc. The way to transform a sprawling, toxic landscape is through changing the public realm, to changing the public space of your city, because that's within the domain of the municipality. So you create a robust street network. So one of the things we've realized is that streets, one of the most underestimated aspects of our cities, are in fact the most potent engines to transform the places in which we live, right? So if you can take streets which have been destroyed by traffic engineers because they were taught in school that the only thing you have to get through a street is cars, and they forgot the idea, which you can see on the photographs on the top, that streets were meant as outdoor living rooms for pedestrians and cars, and all the other members of our city, including trees and birds and all kinds of wonderful things. How can you take the most ubiquitous space in our cities, which is the street, and now make it something incredible? So here is a project, a simple project. This can happen in any city. There's no rocket science about this. This is a very modest city in California called Lancaster. And what they did is, in 2010, during the economic downturn in the US, they invited us to take this street, which was their historic street, which you see on top in the photographs. The dimension of the street is 100 feet from building to building. It has 5 lanes of traffic. Note how wide those lanes are. Note how empty the street is. It looks like a COVID-19 street during the lockdown, right? There's no investment. It's very disinvested. And where do we now invest the money that they had got as a grant to make something wonderful out of it? So what we did is something very, very simple. Because there's a grid of streets around it and the traffic can be distributed, you keep the curbs. You do not break the curbs because that's where the underground infrastructure is. You keep the sidewalks, you keep the parking. You take the middle lanes, you make it a pedestrian zone which is porous because the water can now go into the ground. You harvest the water, you put some lighting, you make it a shaded zone because it's a very hot climate. But this space also can transform into something as wonderful as this. Now, this is nothing new. This has been done in India. It's happening everywhere. That's the good news. The most wonderful thing about this project is after we finished our design, the city took it and implemented the whole thing in 8 months. Now, this is a very important point because none of us in our firm can claim sole credit for this project. We did one part of it, but the other part of it was the implementation and the follow through. My point is that the eventual success of urbanism doesn't come from an architect or a designer alone. It comes from the collaborative process of important visionaries who follow through and carry this project forward in a successive way, keeping the core ideas of a vision alive. This is the Christmas celebration and the weekly farmers market that today happens in this street. And the other beautiful thing that happened within 3 years, because this street became sort of the iconic heart of the city, developers came and they wanted to build housing here, people wanted to live here, and the city invested $14 million and reaped back more than $300 million of investment. Investing in public spaces is not just about making places alone. It is a wonderful economic strategy. It's a social strategy to bring people together, because it's also a way for making cities inclusive. When you have public spaces like this, and when you design housing intelligently around it, which I'll talk about, people of different income groups can now stake a claim in a common space. Whether I own a Maserati or whether, I'm living in a small little apartment, it doesn't matter what my income is. It's like a beach in Goa, when you go to the beach, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you enjoy the beach nonetheless. Giving people the same right in a city through public space is of the absolute essence of making cities more equitable. The second issue is about ecology. Right, so you have sprawling landscapes where the ecological index is absolutely minimal. These are landscapes, particularly highways, that regional highways that connect one place to the other. And this is a classic case where you see the chronological advance from 1997 to 2019 of how the presence of highway attracts, boxy development with parking lots in front of it and destroys this landscape really to make it a sea of asphalt. So the other important agenda is what landscape architects, particularly some of the more interesting landscape architects today, have called foresting the city. And it's a term I love to use because basically we're saying instead of the forest being outside the city, let's think of the city as an extended park. Let's think of the city as an extended forest. So taking these conduits, which we've sort of thought of only for mobility, and planting them with incredible trees, making them boulevards, making them wonderful parkways with trees and birds and local ecology and harvesting techniques becomes of the absolute essence. In other words, they become the scaffold around which sustainable development can happen. And here are examples of this. Now, the same is true when we think about freeways. Now, we are across the US at least, there is now a concerted campaign to rethink what freeways, the damage that freeways have done in our cities. This is my own city in Pasadena. And this is one of the freeways that goes right through the city. It fractures the city into two. Now this is a terrible fracture because you're not only displacing communities, you're creating a cleft socially and economically because the amount of land that you're taking away is really significant in terms of what it could be. So this was a project where like-minded citizens, not architects, like-minded citizens in Pasadena came together. Some of us were architects, and we met for about 3 weekends, and we created a vision for this place that basically said, this is a simple diagram produced in a weekend that said, instead of having a crazy cleft, you can take traffic through this place by making it a magnificent boulevard. You can bring in new development, you can stitch the city together. And through the concerted campaign of this neighborhood association, we actually managed to block the freeway from happening. So citizen activism, combined with all the expertise we bring as architects and economists and other words, can actually be a potent tool for changing the way we think of how we live in our cities. The idea of foresting the city also has implications on conservation. This is a project in Panama. And it's a very interesting project because when we think of conservation, we often think of it at various scales, the scale of the building, the scale of a district. What about the scale of an entire historic city? So here's an entire historic city designed by the Spanish, called David actually. And the little development you see in pink is a land holding that was owned by a private developer. And they wanted to do some development there. Now, when you think about it as development on its own, that's one way of thinking about it. But the other way of thinking about it is that it's an extension of the city. In other words, if you can really think of a pilot project that can become a model of how to extend the city, the growing historic city, and then becomes a model that you can replicate, not in form, but in strategy, now you can create something wonderful. So what we did is we started this exploration through landscape, not through architecture. We brought in an ecologist and a landscape architect, and we documented everything that was going on in terms of the ecosystem of this historic town. And you can see this amazing sort of forest, the green forest ribbons that come through, many of which are randomly destroyed, because you can see that if that's the historic city and that's the wetland in which it sits, right? All of these sprawl pods have happened randomly. They happen everywhere in every part of the world. But what they do is they create ruptures. For example, this at one point must have connected to that. And this sprawl piece came and nobody cared about it. And they destroyed this forest. And this is gone now. And this is gone. And this is gone. So the dendritic network that once surrounded the town is now gone and obliterated. So one of the questions we asked in this is, instead of thinking of development as a detriment to ecology, is it possible for development to be quite the opposite? Is it possible for development to be the catalyst that now stitches broken nature? And what we ended up doing is through the auspices of our landscape architect and our urbanists and all of us coming together, we converted first of all. So let me orient you here. This is a highway, a national highway that connects Panama to Colombia. So it's a national highway. It's a very wide road. This is the development in the picture, and you can see that a ribbon of forest goes around here. So we had a choice whether to obliterate this forest or whether to keep it, right? So what we ended up doing is we kept the forest, obviously. We converted the highway into a massive boulevard. So I'm talking about foresting. And what you see here is a self-sustaining district, which has a park, a park, a park, and a fourth park in the forest. It has a promenade that takes you through to the heart of the town center. And the advantage of doing this is you can now phase this and build this as the first phase where everyone has a piece of this. You can phase that, you can phase that, you can phase that. All of this is based on traditional precedents of urban design, right? This is not rocket science. We visited Charleston, we visited some beautiful pre-war towns designed by the Spanish. We looked at some of the lessons. And that's the inspiration for this place. Now, the most beautiful thing about it is we then began to look at the forest. And our landscape architect went into the forest and documented all of the trees that were native to the flora of the forest. And what we did is that all the streets that you see here are now carried on as designs that extend this native landscape into the town. So what you're doing basically is you're creating street sections and public realms like I showed you by bringing this into this. And the result, of course, is that now you get a development that is not the kind of sprawl that you see here, but a development that is self-sustaining because it has retail right here, it has an office program right here, it has a residential neighborhood right here. So in other words, if you live here, there's no reason for you, unless you really want to do it, to get on the freeway and go into the city. You can have all your daily needs within the idea of this district. It's a walkable district. Now imagine a model where this historic city has neighborhoods that are self-sustaining all around it, with streets that bring in the natural flora, stitching broken nature. So this is a model. It's actually broken ground, and we hope that they will carry this idea through. In the rural aspect of the urban landscape, the same idea of foresting the city can be continued. This was a very interesting project in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the southwest of the United States, where the client had a large estate in which there were some beautiful buildings. It was a farming estate. There were some lavender fields in there that you see here. And what he wanted to do originally, as they always do, and you see this happening in all parts of the world, is destroy everything that was in there, divide it, subdivide it, sell these, make the money, and go away. And what we managed to do, and again, a lot of credit goes to the client here, because eventually you need a person to make these decisions, is we eventually managed to give him the same number of units, but actually clustered in the form of hamlets, while keeping the forest and the agriculture completely alive on a pristine basis. Now imagine estates in outside all our cities, particularly in India, because you have so many beautiful ones with plantations, etc., doing this, where you actually bring in development because that helps keep the economy going, but you do it in a way and a form that creates covenants where you will preserve nature and agriculture for posterity. This is a choice we have. It is not an easy sell, it's not business as usual, but we must try to convince people to actually do it. And that's the aerial of the estate, as you see. Transit. Many of you know this. It's a wonderful thing. It's picking up in India beautifully. Transit is a great blessing for us. There's a lot of talk about what's going to happen to transit during the COVID conditions, but my answer is very simple. You and I can afford to sit in our cars and go wherever we want, but there are millions of people all over the world that cannot afford a car. Transit is their only option. So imagine taking transit as a very important catalyst in the city and taking our transit nodes, whether they are bus stops, whether they are train stops, and investing money in these places. Now why? Because transit stops are places where the rich and the poor, where in hundreds, where the old and the new, the children and the older generation, they'll all come there in some place or the other. So why would you not make these places the most beautiful so that everyone can enjoy them? I mean, this is such a simple thing to do. It's happening in so many parts of the world beautifully. So transit-oriented development, or whatever you want to call it, essentially is about visioning places around transit stations that are absolutely beautiful. This has implications on urban design. This is an urban design proposal for one of the transit stations in South Pasadena in an American city, but it also has implications on architecture. Because what you want to do is you also want to densify housing and mix of uses next to transit station, because the whole incentive of living next to a train or a bus stop where you don't have to rely on your car is a wonderful thing. So if you can bring in density in forms that are contextually responsible, that they don't obliterate the surroundings, they don't destroy the character of a historic neighborhood, etc. So this is a project, a very difficult project we did about 10 years ago now, where the existing zoning of this city was not ready for transit-oriented development. So the buildings were only supposed to be 4 and 5 stories tall around a transit station per the zoning rules of the city. What we said to the city, and these are graphics we had to show the city, is if you do it at 4 and 5 stories per your rules, you're going to get a building that looks like this. Now this is not urban design. This is some architect coming and making what we call a pancake building. It's a stacked building which maximizes your FSI, and then you create courtyards to bring in light. And then, depending on how talented you are as an architect, you put all kinds of games on it and some windows and some tricks, and you call it architecture. And that's great. I don't want to say anything about that. If you're doing urban design along with architecture, you are now looking at what's around it, what's behind it, what you want, what's the pedestrian scale, how you want to create mixes of uses, all that kind of stuff comes in. So depending on the idea that buildings on the street were 3 and 4 stories only, what we said to the city is, instead of making 5-story buildings everywhere, why don't we make the buildings along the street 3 and 4 stories only? But what that means is the amount of FSI we have lost here, we need to gain it somewhere, because otherwise it doesn't work for a developer. So we have to put that FSI inside the block where you will not see it from the street. In order to do that, we will have to violate the FSI envelope in 3 or 4 places, right? We appealed to the city to violate their own zoning rules on the basis of merit. The fortunate thing is in the US, as maybe you have it in India too, there is a legal process called variance, where you can actually appeal to the council of the city to give you exemptions to the zoning based on design merit, and it's a very important process. It's not taken lightly because you set a precedent when you do it. In this case, we got as many as 10 variances on this project, and here was the other complication. The train lines went through the middle of the project. Now, when you have a train line going through the middle of the project, this amount of land is actually owned by the metro authorities. It is not owned by the developer. The developer only owns that and that, right? Because of the amount of parking, we had to go 4 levels underground. But this is a very unique moment in the construction of the project. You can see that the parking is being dug, right? It's a very expensive proposition because you cannot dig the whole thing. You have to leave this intact, which means that you have to shore here and shore here as well. Note that the train was going to be active in 1.5 years. So construction of the little tunnel through which, the gateway through which our train was going to pass, this is the only portion of the building that spans the tracks. So we are constructing it along with a parking garage. Here is a shot where the train is active and the steel is being poured around and the building is under construction. You can see that that tunnel, that portal, which was being constructed originally, is now completely finished. And finally, in another year or so, the entire project was built. Now, what is interesting about this project is that this little building that you see here was the original station in the 1920s where people got down on this train track. I don't know if you know this, but Los Angeles, surprising to many people, had was one of the world's most important transit cities in the 1920s and 30s. It had 1,000 miles of train tracks. And by the time the freeways began to come in and with the rise of the automobile, systematically these train tracks were dismantled and they were replaced by freeways. And so all of these train tracks, which were historic, now became abandoned places, and this was lying in shambles as a station that once had so many memories in it and was lying in ruins. So what we ended up doing as part of this transit-oriented development is taking this building, we moved it to the park, we dismantled it, we restored it, and we brought it back as a restaurant. So this is a historic project that conserves this building with 350 units of housing right in the middle of a train station around a plaza. And that's the building from the outside. You can see the station going through. These are all apartments where people live. There's a train going right through the building. And here's the restored project with the plaza, with the trains whizzing past. Now, we come to another subject, affordable housing. 1.2 billion people don't have adequate shelter. What do we do about it? This is a book that we're talking about practicing in other ways. This is a book where we brought about 30 people who've been invested in so many different parts of the world. MVRDV, Samip Padora from India, who's doing some very nice work. Ashok Lal, many of you have heard these names. Lev's Architecture, Giancarlo Mazzanti. All of us came together and we said, let's think about inclusiveness and affordable housing in our own ways and sharing knowledge. And we brought this book together. It's available on Amazon if you'd like. But the idea that I want to put forth is in our practice. One of the things we've been doing over the last 20 years is really trying to excavate what we consider to be the forgotten aspects of traditional housing. And now I venture into the blurry world where conservation, architecture, urban design all becomes one. There is no line that separates them, because the moment you go to a place and you ask yourself the question, what is already there that I want to keep? You entered the world of conservation. You've already begun to trace links to the past. So we realize that the debacle of modern housing across the world has happened because modern housing denies context. Modern housing, I'm only talking about modern housing, I could speak on modernism differently, but modern housing fundamentally denies urban context in the sense that it actually plugs itself and creates abstract objects in even the most historic places that denies, thousands or hundreds of years of character that has developed in place. What we've been doing as beginning with scholarship is in Southern California, we realized that between the densities of housing, which are 4 dwelling units to the acre in the case of a single family house, and 200 dwelling units to the acre in the case of a tower, there is a whole range of housing typologies, each of which give us different densities. So that's 4 dwelling units to the acre. Duplexes, 8 dwelling units to the acre. Bungalow courts, 15 dwelling units to the acre. Courtyard housing, 40 dwelling units to the acre, etc., etc. And we documented all of them. So you begin the study of housing with excavating traditional types that have been forgotten. And then you ask the question, can these be built today? Are the lessons of these housing projects applicable today? They were obviously, these were designed in the 1800s, 1900s, when cars were not there. But now, can you adapt the wisdom of this housing to living conditions that are today? And so I just want to take you through some projects that straddle conservation, affordability, everything. The first one is really about saving old houses. All right. I mean, if there's one aspect of architecture that is about creating things anew, I think there is another aspect of architecture which is simply about not letting build and scrap practices go on. I mean, we live in a world where we cannot afford build and scrap, in my opinion. I mean, there's too much waste in the world already. So if you have houses that you can salvage, that you can actually move, if houses have to be demolished for new development in cities as they upzone themselves, which you have to do, can you now take these houses, take these homes, move them to other places, and really make something out of them? So this is a historic project where in the night on a truck, they were taken to another site, put on new foundations. We actually, there's 6 homes, 6 bungalows made out of wood. Garages were added to them, yards were added to them, and they're arranged in a simple configuration with a common court. And the result is just a simple, absolutely simple project that now can house people in a very simple way, right in the middle of a single-family neighborhood. So what could have happened didn't happen because you now you salvaged it, you added chimneys, you restored this project, and you made new housing out of it. My point is that new housing is not new in terms of design alone. New housing can establish continuity by salvaging historic material and recasting it in new forms. The same can be done by amalgamating it with new design. Now, this is another case where existing houses on a site were maintained, they were kept, they were restored at the back, and in the front of these houses, so these houses that you see right here are right there. And they are all restored around a common court, and in front of them, new housing is built from scratch, reviving the best traditions of Southern California houses in the craftsman style. Now, so in other words, this is new, this is old, and the amalgamation of it now creates complex housing because you now have people who are low income, mid income, workforce, etc., living in the same site and meeting in the same place, which is what inclusiveness is truly all about. Inclusiveness is not about taking the people who are poor and shoving them into one part of the city. Inclusiveness is about creating housing where people of different incomes can live together, sharing the same space. The third idea is to revive traditions based on climate and ecology. So this is a project in a hot desert called Arizona, in Arizona, in Tucson. And one of the great traditions of housing in that region was the idea that you would create clusters of housing in what we call compounds. So this is about, 70 meters by 70 meters in terms of India. There's, 200 feet by 200 feet. And you basically have C-shaped or L-shaped units that are huddled up together with little patios that really, share walls, for example, because you don't want too much of the heat to come in. The walls are thick. You have plantations, and in the you have cacti and local plants, and in the middle, this void that you see sort of meandering, this amorphous void in the middle of the housing, is the place that originally is where people carried on their agriculture. So each little compound would have its own agriculture, and this would be a self-sustaining community. Now, obviously, we don't need to have agriculture today. It's not possible to do it everywhere. So what we landed up doing is using the model, putting decomposed granite here, and actually using this as a place for the cars to come in and also make a place for the social life of the entire neighborhood. And the replication of this then begins to create a community. And these are some of the houses that got built. The whole thing is still under construction, but you can see very simple houses. Some of these were made of straw bale, where you take husk and you package it together, and instead of using brick or heavy materials, you actually make it very, very light. We salvaged a lot of the local cacti and planted them back in the houses. This is production housing, as simple as this. But the fact is, in their character and in their materiality, they simply revive the ideas of the past that we have forgotten. In a neighborhood close by called Rio Nuevo, we did something else. These are sketches done during the original workshop of the project. You can see a quick sketch of the street. Now, many of you who know some of these colonial traditions, including the place I was born in, Poonam lives in, Goa, for example. There's something very magical about these kind of streets. Basically, you fundamentally have walls and a rhythm of windows and nothing else, and just simple landscape, a few scuppers, a few changing skylines, shifts in the walls, etc., create just enduring places that don't do anything more than what you need, and the result is magical streetscapes. Of course, the problem is, as architects, the only thing we are taught is if you're given any context, you got to stand out like crazy. You got to be the loudest, the noisiest, you got to be different. So the question that we've faced when we've designed neighborhoods is, how do you make architects behave? We're full of ourselves, so we love to be full of ourselves. So if you have 5 architects that are designing next to each other, how do you make sure that you actually get a streetscape? If we all love these streetscapes, then why don't we design them? How do you make them behave? So what we ended up doing here is we said, look, we told the builders, we're going to design with you, with the production builders, just the facade of the street. And the architects can design the house behind it. You can do whatever you want. You can design the most creative house that you want. But the production builders should come together and work with us to create some semblance of what the street might become. So this was a pilot that we did, where we built the walls, and behind them the architect actually went and designed the homes, and the result is actually quite wonderful. A few of these houses have been built, but you can see that the exterior facade is all that the urbanists actually come through, and the architects actually end up filling it in with all kinds of creative housing. We now come to a beautiful typology in Southern California called courtyard housing. Courtyard housing is not new to India. In tropical climates, the incredible wisdom of living outdoors has been known to us forever, so this is nothing new to many of you. But it surprises me that we forget many of these things. I don't have to remind you, some of the most intelligent architects of the past generation in India reminded us of this constantly in their work and in their writing, and they need to be acknowledged. So this is nothing new to many of us. But nonetheless, in Southern California, for example, there's a beautiful tradition. When the Spanish had colonized Southern California, they brought with them Mediterranean precedents. And one of the precedents was, instead of living in buildings with corridors, where you go into a lobby, you go up in an elevator, you cross a corridor, and you go into a unit that is not ventilated, you actually have a building where there is no corridor. And you arrange the units in such a way that you have courtyards that are not just spaces between the buildings, but actually gardens that are outdoor living rooms where you spend most of your life. So we began to do a concerted study on courtyard housing, and we finally found a client who had inherited this piece of land, and although the zoning allowed for 30 units of housing, we convinced him that if you do only 20 units of housing, you could sell them and rent them for a lot more. So again, an enlightened client who was not out to maximize his FSI, but actually create a quality product in the market that was against the grain of business as usual. And the result was wonderful, because you now have a sloping site where this is the lowest point, this is the highest point. You take the garage underneath, this is the parking underneath. So because this is low, you can go down and you can park the site underneath here, and then you climb up, you go through a what we call a zaguan, or a passage, and you enter these open to sky courtyards around which people live. Now note that there are no corridors, because the lower floor of these units enters directly through the courtyards, and the upper floors enter through individual stairs that are sold as part of the unit. So in a conventional apartment building, you lose about 15 to 18%, sometimes even 20% of your building, which you cannot sell because it involves exit stairs and corridors, etc. When you do housing like this, you may not be able to maximize your FSI, but you can sell 100% of the building almost, because there is no circulation corridor that you're now losing. And the result was wonderful, I think, because we managed to create and revive a substitute to what we think could have been a conventional apartment building. And this is a building that obviously is a homage to the great Mediterranean traditions of Southern California. Very simple building of stucco homes that is now broken into individual masses. So instead of creating the image of a large single building, you break it into a townscape, right? And that's the whole idea. You break this into smaller units. That's the beauty of the villages that we love, at least I think. This is the entrance. You walk through this passage, and these are the courtyards. This is just one of them, where the courtyard is an outdoor living room. You have a place, a fireplace where you sit down. You enter this unit straight through the ground, or you climb up the stair to go to your unit above. Again, a different typology that now eliminates the idea of stacked housing is the only choice that we have to live today. The other tragedy, and this is a science that can be applied at any scale. For example, if you think of the tragedy of modern housing, this is the tragedy in one slide, right? Where you have a historic city, an architect comes, takes 12 city blocks, throws it into the garbage bin, and in the name of urban renewal, designs a project which looks like this, right? Now, he or she is taught in architecture school that you have to angle your building to get maximum orientation to whatever light. So that's the most important thing. The rest doesn't matter. This city does not matter. The only thing that matters is your site. And the result is this. You get a mega block where the same building repeats itself in the name of social housing. And this is the debacle of social housing all across the world. Why has social housing in the modernist tradition failed in so many parts of the world? Not because it did not house people. It housed people in thousands. It failed because it was socially inept. It did not create public spaces for the people. There was no transit strategy. People did not have traffic to go to their jobs, and as a result, people did not want to live there. The result, of course, all across the world was the destruction of the historic city. It is these kind of projects done through franchised architects who went to some of the best schools in the world, who destroyed historic cities one after the other in the name of utopia. I can say this with a straight face because after 20 years of practice, I think this was one of the greatest tragedies that we have seen in our times. We can do the same thing if we look at traditional cities. We can achieve the same densities that were achieved right here in forms that are entirely different and applicable today in ways that are much more than aesthetics. The advantage of doing and reviving low-rise high density, a formula and a rubric that has been espoused by so many great architects in India again and again and again, that high-rise high density is not the answer. Low-rise high density is the answer. And the reason is not only are you more close to the earth, not only are you socially more cohesive in terms of your open spaces, but most of the units in a project like this are cross-ventilated. Now, these are all things that are known amply in India, right? Because we don't have the energy, we don't have air conditioners, poor people cannot afford it. So these sciences exist in India. Some of the best housing projects in India have done this so beautifully. So these are things that need to reach the least common denominator of architecture. It shouldn't be, a handful of elite architects talking about this. That's ridiculous. If only 2 or 3 people talk about this and we worship them, then nothing has come out of it. What we need to do is take these sciences into the schools, teach students about why these things matter, how to craft these ideas, because that is the way we're going to transform the way forward. There's some noise on the way here. Could someone please mute? There's a lot of noise. Okay. Okay, thank you. My second book was on Asian cities. When I came to the United States, I began to realize that the paucity of scholarship on some of the oldest cities in the world was appalling. I mean, think of the great irony. For those of us that had the privilege of studying in different parts of the world, I can speak for Poonam here as well. You go to the West and you begin to realize that there is so much scholarship on Western cities, but the oldest cities in the world are not in the West. The oldest cultures of the world are not in the West; they're elsewhere. The oldest heritage in the world is not in the West, it's elsewhere. And yet we don't have enough scholarship on it. So, so there are now, of course, many scholars who are thinking of this, and that's a wonderful thing. And obviously, there's also a geopolitical shift, and Asia has come to the forefront. Latin America has come to the forefront, so that's wonderful. So this was a book we did a long time ago. We brought 30 people together and talked about, what Asian cities mean, how Asian cities are talking about futures that Western cities have never seen. What are the issues that are shaping Asian cities, and why are they different? Point I'm making is what stemmed out in the form of practice in this book is that Asia, the global South, the non-West, if I can call it, offers us enormous canvases to practice in ways that we don't get to in the West. For example, here is, and I'm saying this because it's a great form of cultural engagement. Here is a new town we did in Saudi Arabia. Now, this is a town that is actually a homage to all the great traditions of the Islamic world. If you think about it, there is a mosque that faces Mecca, there is a souk, there is a campus, it's a desert town, so all the housing is clustered very closely. The most beautiful thing is that the town is entirely surrounded by groves of palms, and I don't have to tell you why. There are sandstorms, and we learned that the most beautiful way of keeping yourself protected from sandstorms was to grow just orchards of palm trees, which were a beautiful signature in these places. So, these kind of traditions are ways of sort of reviving ideas that you don't get to practice. So this is about creating cultural signatures about places, investing architecture as a means of bringing back heritage that is forgotten in the name of the rupture that happened through modernism. Production housing, one of the debacles of housing, where cheap developers come and take the same house and multiply it for acres of land. You can actually shift this rubric very easily. We tried to do this in Dubai. This project did not get built, but what we tried to do in Dubai is, I remember going to Dubai and asking my friends, would you like, just take me I want to see what Dubai was before it became a mega city. And my friend took me to Bastakia. Many of you who know Dubai probably know Bastakia. Bastakia is the last surviving fragment of the historic piece of Dubai, where there are these 20 or 30 houses with cooling towers. And I was just completely, taken. The charm of these houses was wonderful. So we tried very hard to bring some of these ideas into the housing. So here was production housing. So fundamentally what I'm telling you is, all these houses that you see here have the same plan, the exact same plan. All we have done is we have changed the outside of these houses. They all have cooling towers in some form or the other so that the air escapes out. And when you bring them together, you now get streetscapes and townscapes that revive and keep a link to a past that these amazingly wonderful places have forgotten. Not only are these buildings simple and sustainable, but they also take you back to a side of the story which has been completely obliterated. For what reason, I do not know. So I'd love to discuss this with all of you today. This is another incredible project we did for the Bohra community. The Bohra community, as you know, is a minority, sect of Islam, a wonderful Orthodox sect, and we had the privilege of being invited to compete for one of their campuses. This was in Nairobi, in Kenya. So I don't want to get into details, but you can see that what was beautiful about it is that the mosque is the center of the campus. This is the mosque right in the middle. These are the dining halls, the classrooms are there, and because of gender separation, which is the most rigorous important thing for them, the men's dorms are here, the women's dorms are here, the women's classrooms are here, the men's classrooms are here. The men walk on the ground as they go to the mosque each morning. The women come from the top through a bridge to the mosque. So it's an incredible way of respecting the cultural genomes, meeting them where they are, and creating a language of architecture that is entirely theirs. We worked with many of their members in this community to craft this architecture rather than abstracting it. So just to conclude with a few quick ones. So this is the latest book that came out 2 years ago, Heritage Conservation, and I want to now get a little bit into the joy of practices research, which is excavating aspects that remain marginalized. 15 years ago, I had a student from Persia. She spoke Farsi. And our collaboration resulted in a wonderful study where we rediscovered, I should say, this wonderful city called Yazd, which is the epicenter of the Zoroastrian faith. The fire of the Zoroastrian faith burns in Yazd. And I knew about Yazd because it was a World Heritage Site. I knew it as a city of wind towers. But what I didn't know, which we excavated and wrote a paper on this, is that the wind tower was essentially the end of a long regional infrastructure called the Qanat. And the Qanats were subterranean water channels that brought water from the aquifer of the Zagros Mountains under the earth into the reservoirs called the Abanbars, then into the mosques, and then into the house. This was an incredible piece of heritage that existed. For years, it went completely unnoticed. And finally, it gave me such happiness to find that 3 years ago, UNESCO finally recognized the Qanat as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So there are so many such vernacular infrastructures that exist all across the world. They do not have a voice. They do not even have an eye. Nobody has seen them. Nobody knows about them. I'm showing you this because one of the great responsibilities we must carry on our shoulders is the ability to excavate these ideas, to advocate for the preservation of these kind of things. So what we proposed in this idea is the Qanat is very difficult to preserve the Qanat because it's underground. The city has been built over. Nobody knows who owns the Qanat. Many of them have completely been dismantled. There are very few of them surviving. In fact, we did a quick analysis of them. You can see from the pre-Islamic era to 2011. You can see that till 1979, there were still Qanats existing under the ground. But most of them have now been obliterated. And these are the kind of landscapes, the Qanats. They're surface wells that go underground that are connected to beautiful dendritic water channels that exist all around and under the city. But you can't preserve them for the sake of nostalgia because they do not supply water for the growing city. They are gravity fed. They depend on the rainfall because their water comes from the aquifer. So what we proposed, and this is the idea of practice as a propository act, that you don't need a client for this. You can just excavate it, propose it, and advocate for it. Is that as the city is growing and getting its water supply from 5,000 miles away with industrial infrastructure, you can supplement that industrial infrastructure by reinventing the Qanat as a grey water recycling system. What this means is that you collect the water from all the buildings, as many as you can on a neighborhood basis, because you use the dendritic network with motorized technology to go against gravity. See, initially, the water would come from the reservoirs into the houses. Now you take the water from the houses back into the reservoirs, you convert the reservoirs into water treatment plants locally, and you return the water back. So what you're doing is you're reducing the load on the water supply of the city that relies exclusively on the rivers that are far away. My point is that the reuse of industrial infrastructure, the reuse of vernacular infrastructure can offer us incredible potentials for rethinking what urbanization means in a time of climate change. I strongly encourage all of you to take this subject on. Vernacular infrastructure, vernacular habitats, water urbanisms, vernacular settlements is a subject that is a huge vacuum of scholarship. We need to pick it up and think about it. And I don't have to tell you how rich India is in this subject. From the valves to the stepped wells, I mean, we have hundreds of such things. Now, the problem is the way we have learned to document them is purely as artifacts. This is my criticism. Look at all the wonderful documentation that has been done on the stepped wells of India. It's purely architectural. When was the last time you saw a documentation that talked about the entire water system? Right? That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about recasting the rubric of how we document these places, not as architectural artifacts to be fetishized, but as systems that can be reused or rethought from an ecological perspective today. I was an exchange scholar to Japan a long time ago. After 20 years of revisiting and visiting Japan, I finally wrote a book on Japan, and I just want to point out 3 or 4 things to spark the discussion today. These are figure fields of Tokyo. Now you can see that in a normal figure field, a city will start as a black blob and keep growing. But that's not what happens in Tokyo. Tokyo grows from the 1600s, and then a huge gray area appears, and then it's filled in. And then it grows, and another gray area appears, and then it's filled in. And then it's shattered again, and then it's filled in. It goes on and on and on. Tokyo is a city that has been destroyed by tsunamis, earthquakes, and typhoons from time to time to time. So my question to you is, how would you live in a city that you know will be destroyed from time to time? That's a very interesting question. So Tokyo, more than any other city in the world, is a city I continue to go back to reflect on, sort of shatter my own preconceptions of what cities mean. Because Tokyo challenges every notion of the Western city. Here's a documentation of Shinjuku-dori, one of the roads, one of the major streets in Tokyo. And you can see that because of land scarcity, the lot size of the buildings, the width of the lots on which the buildings sit, is between 5 to 20 feet. This would be illegal in the United States. I don't know if it is legal in India, but in Japan it is. So the nature of development, the nature of urbanization is entirely different because of the constraints a place like Japan faces. From a conservation perspective, the place that I've been studying for almost 15 years now is one of the most ancient places in Japan, the Ise Shrine. Many of you know this as a Shinto shrine. It's a huge misnomer because essentially the Ise Shrine is 2 shrines, not the 2 you see here, but 2 complexes with 60 structures that are 5 kilometers apart. Here's the point. So we've been documenting this, and this is an ongoing study. We've been documenting the rituals of rebuilding the Ise Shrine, etc., documenting the context within which Ise sits through GIS studies, etc. But the most important finding that we've come across is this. In the original ideas of rebuilding the shrines every 20 years, all of the wood would come from the forest that surrounded the shrine. Because of urbanization, these forests have now depleted. And because they've depleted, I'm sorry, there's a printer that's going crazy here. Because the forests have actually depleted themselves, what has now happened is that the wars and the battles that Japan has gone through, including World War II, etc., has contaminated the soil. And the forests are neither able to produce the wood of the quality that's required for the shrines, nor are they available in terms of quantity. And the result is that the wood that is required to rebuild the shrines has now got to be shipped from 5,000 miles away. My point is that when you shift the focus of heritage from the object to the context, you now excavate so many pressure points that are crucial to the future of the place. So the point I wish to make is, I say this to my students constantly about the Taj Mahal. I didn't want to talk about that today, but just to give you an example, we all know the Taj Mahal as the white mausoleum. But I can tell you with a straight face that from my own studies, that the secret of the success of the Taj Mahal's future lies on the revitalization of the Yamuna River. If the river is dried, the pile foundations of the Taj Mahal become unstable, and the Taj Mahal will not survive. So the linchpins to conservation do not lie in the object alone. They lie far beyond the object into excavating the numerous other agencies that will really bring meaning to what this means. And I'm showing you these slides below because this is the kind of rupture that we find in many historic settings, where you have beautiful houses of a particular scale and a particular character, and by law, you are allowed in the name of architecture to destroy it this way. We should talk about this today because I would love to hear what other people think about this. And then finally, just to return this back to my roots in India, because it is who I am eventually, my first book was on Hindu temples. I was born in a Hindu family in India. My cultural upbringing was shaped by the foundations of Hindu rituals. And as I grew up to become an architect and an urbanist, I began to realize that this beautiful phenomenon that I had seen as a little boy, but I had failed to notice its impact on the city, was now beginning to really become the most important thing for me, and that is the ubiquitous presence of wayside shrines, the magical metamorphosis, where in India, this whole phenomenon of tree worship that eventually grows through anonymous insignia, through just continuous communal patronage, and then grows into rudimentary shacks, and then becomes sort of semi-franchise temples. And finally, the tree dies, but the spot remains sacred and becomes a temple and begins to urbanize and gains commercial activity. So if you look at this image, which is the Arunachaleshwara temple in Tiruvannamalai, one of the most beautiful South Indian temples, the Dravidian temple, when we look at it, you think it's a built at once complex, because the relationships between the gopurams, it's like some wonderful architect designed it at once. But that's not true. It actually happened just like this. It was an anonymous little lingam, and then it got compounded, and another one, and another one. And over the years, it became the epicenter of an entire city. So the bottom line is that the teleological end of this incredible metamorphosis continues to this day. So we cannot ignore the importance of the sacred, not as a philosophical domain, but as an urban catalyst. Okay, sacredness and sacred aspects bear an indelible influence on the shape of the Indian city. They always will, they always have. And to ignore them, to not bring them into the mainstream agenda of planning, of urban design, is ridiculous. So another way of saying it is, we operate in our cities as if the West has all the answers. This is catastrophic, right? I mean, if you think about it, all the zoning that is going on in India right now was borrowed from the West. All right? It may fulfill one aspect of our cities, but not the other, because there are magical things going on in India and other places that we must acknowledge. Here's the evolution of the Meenakshi temple in Madurai. These are all diagrams from the book, right? And you can see there's a tradition of morphology in Dravidian temples. There are Dravidian temples documented to the same scale. There are villages where incredible patronage happens through purely communal management. There is no formal processes. This is my own village in Goa, where hundreds of people come together every year and create incredible rituals through their own means. There are wonderful everyday urbanisms that are happening. This is right in the heart of Connaught Place in Delhi. I documented this at 6 a.m. in the morning one day, where you capture the rituals of a place. Incredible stuff. This will probably become a temple very soon. And finally, another city that I return to from time to time to challenge my preconceptions of what cities are, which is, of course, Banaras. I've been studying Banaras for 20 years, and I will continue to study it throughout my life, because it's a city that I don't think there's so much in this city that a lifetime may not be enough to understand what it is. But I want to highlight 2 points in conclusion. This is a diagram we did of Banaras, which shows the Panchakoshi Yatra, which is the largest pilgrimage. It's a 5-kilometer long pilgrimage that takes 7 days to finish. And while the core of the city is here, you actually venture far outside the city. So the Panchakoshi Yatra begins at the Vishwanath temple, goes past the Ghats, which are here, and then goes all the way into the peri-urban territories, etc. What you see in these 5 sort of temple icons are the 5 halting spots, because you cannot finish this yatra in one night. You halt for 5 nights. These halting spots are dharmashalas, where you can cook and you can stay, and they are lying in shambles. And it continues to surprise me, because before the COVID condition began, millions of people, millions if not thousands, come each year to engage in this yatra. So all of us architects who go to Banaras, everyone focuses right here. But if we turn our attention to these spots, and we've been documenting them, and we are now creating a scheme for the Kardameshwar spot right here, we now begin to chart a citywide strategy that can begin to revitalize the city on its own terms, not using zoning rules, not really talking about Western ways of thinking about it alone, but really talking about the catalytic ideas that are of this city truly and nowhere else. And I'll end on this slide, which is the reminder of what Banaras has always taught me, which is that at the end of the day, every city is experienced completely differently by different people. We as architects, we as educated purveyors of shaping the built environment may think we have the answers, but we may have only the wrong answers eventually, or perhaps answers that are occasionally right, or perhaps answers that may be fully right at one point but not the other. The only point I'm making is it is dangerous for us to assume, as architects or whoever we call ourselves, that we have the right to impose the solutions of what the future of the city means. These are diagrams done in Benares by different people. This was done by James Prinsep, right, the British mapping. This is a diagram done by a priest who maps Benares as a cosmic diagram. This is a diagram done by an artist who takes the Nandi bull of Shiva and puts all the temples on it, etc., etc., etc. Depending on who you are, you will see the city differently. For some, these slides may seem like an anachronism, that you're being transported to the 12th century, that this doesn't belong to the 21st. But I would argue that it is also a reminder that there are so many indigenous modernities that are happening in front of us right now. If we keep ourselves not as outsiders to a city, that come into the city, come with preconceived ideas, a toolkit of some agenda of what architecture is, and plant something there and go, and not worry about the consequences, that's one attitude. The second attitude is quite the opposite. You come to a city like a baby, innocent, pure, absolutely with no preconception. You talk to the city, you change the vantage point from an outsider to an insider. You will find so many wonderful answers that you would never find with the place that you came from. I'd end on this slide, which is that at the end of the day, whether we are designers, whether we are architects, however we may be, however talented we may be, the city is only as successful as how everybody feels about it. The greatest thing we can do in our profession at the end of the day is to encourage awareness of the city. And I invoke again David Attenborough, in the same way that David Attenborough has made the whole world realize what is at stake if we don't take care of nature. The thing we have to do, it seems to me, is together, all of us, and hundreds of thousands if we can, generate this kind of awareness of why rethinking cities, not architecture, not one building at a time, not some marble monument somewhere, but thinking of the city, its rivers, its systems, its ecology, everything together, of which architecture and the allied fields form part of. And how do you do this? You write, you think, you advocate. This is a magazine of which I serve as the executive editor. We try as a team to disseminate it. It's published twice a year. Poonam has written some wonderful pieces for it, many others. You fail many times. You don't know what it means. You're struggling. But that's the beauty of it. You may fall short. You may win. That is not the point. The point is to just continue to try. I'll stop there, and hopefully we have some time to take some questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for the extremely informative session. Any student willing to ask a question may raise their hand now from the reactions option. And on your name being called out, you can ask your question.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank Vinayak sir for giving a wonderful presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it actually, and came to know about things that otherwise maybe I would never visit in my life. Just if I'm allowed, I'll just say three things about it. I have one clarification to ask also. I mean, I really enjoyed your unique examples, sir, especially where examples such as the Panama Colombia connecting highway that you took it through a boulevard. I mean, converted into a boulevard to preserve the natural fauna and flora. Those sort of examples, the ways in which you combined transit-oriented development, urban design, and architecture examples. I was especially enthralled by the studies you showed about in Rio Nuevo, Tucson, Arizona, because my own area of study is also mud housing to a certain extent. The examples of traditional earth housing and straw bale housing that you shared, the sketches were wonderful, absolutely out of the world sketches, by the way, sir. So I was wondering in the stucco houses that you were showing in the Mediterranean part of the climate region of the USA. I mean, you were showing some houses which seem to have wind towers as well. Other than the Arabic examples you showed, I noticed maybe the Mediterranean houses also had some wind towers. The whitewashed white walls stucco houses that you showed, line plastered. So it was overall an enthralling presentation. I'd really like to thank you from the core of my heart for sharing these things with us, and it opened up new perspectives. And one thing I'll end on that note. One thing I really appreciated was that I mean, conservation is a vernacular also in a way falls in the realm of conservation. Whenever you that statement really stuck to my heart. I mean, what you said, that whenever you are trying to conserve something of the old, that is actually falling within the realm of conservation. So actually vernacular architecture and all its practices associated, and all those wonderful examples of Yazad and YAZD, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, Yazad in Iraq, I mean somewhere in Middle East, Iraq and all those regions, they are all falling in the realm of conservation. So it opened up new avenues of thinking for us also, and we are thankful to you for presenting. Yeah. Yeah, the students, Shivani, you can ask the students and the other our colleagues, faculty colleagues, if they have other queries for this very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Shivani, you are on unmute.
Yes, sir, sorry, I could not unmute myself from here. Yes, sir. Anyone else who wishes to ask a question may ask now. Sir, I had a question too.
Yeah, you, Shivani.
Yes, sir. So my question was that in Delhi right now, we have the redevelopment projects going on for the streets and the urban areas as well. So what we see as of now is that the central Delhi is already surrounded with multi-story towers, and even the new construction happening in the upcoming areas like Noida and Faridabad are making these multi-story towers in the name of high demand or to adjust higher amount of population. But like talking about the redevelopment of Delhi, the 7 colonies of old Delhi that are being redeveloped, the people staying there right now say that it's merely a land grab and nothing else, because the new construction will not be anything similar to their tradition, their culture, what they've been living through since the past so many years. So my question is that how does such a construction in the name of redevelopment of a place affect its historic context, and what as budding architects, or maybe what as like the existing architects, people can do to actually improve this? Because everywhere in the name of construction we see that it's just people are forgetting the core way of living. The Indian context is being forgotten, so how can that be stopped?
Excellent question.
Thank you, sir.
You know, this is not, I don't know about Delhi. I will not answer this question in the context of Delhi. You have to ask the right people for that. But it is a broader question that is, I think, a wonderful, very sophisticated question. Fundamentally, you are asking, as a city grows and as a city is trying to absorb the pressure of accommodating millions of people in the future. Chandigarh is going through it. So many cities are going through it all over the world. How do you bring in new development? And how do you manage and negotiate all the beautiful things you like about its history? That's the question you're asking. Well, this is a question that every city is going through all across the world. Some cities are doing it well and intelligently, and others are not. So let's talk about the well part, okay? Here's the best examples I have seen, and I'll speak about it broadly so that without being specific to any place. When you think about planning, and then there's a second part to your question, which is what can we do as budding architects? So I'll answer that next. Okay, so the first one is what are the best practices that go in this regard? The best practices are that you first of all ask three fundamental questions. Number one, how fast are you going to allow development to happen? Okay, that's a city's decision. A city is a municipality. Now, the reason regional planning becomes so important is because one city may not have the answer to everything, right? I mean, you may be a city, but if you have to house 2 million people or whatever, 1 million people in the next 10 years, you're like a pressure cooker, and that pressure cooker is only going to get bigger and bigger. But if you now think of a regional plan where you begin to say, oh, here's another city and another city, and you begin to forge a collaborative relationship on a regional basis and write rules that are regional, you can now begin to think of locations to disperse this density and this enormous pressure in ways you cannot do in one city. So that's the first answer to the question. So the answer does not lie in beginning with architecture at all. It begins at a much more beautiful science of the built environment, which is regional planning. That's where regional planning becomes important. And regional planning asks three questions, only three actually, quite simple questions. Where do you put development on a regional scale? What is the form of that development? Okay? And number three, where do you not put development? And if you can answer these three questions intelligently, you've got a fantastic idea. The problem is we don't answer these questions. So, wherever you are in the world, the best practices have taken areas, first of all, and said no development here. A fantastic example of this is Tuscany. If you go to the Tuscan countryside, for example, where there are vineyards, etc., you do not touch that countryside, right? So you take areas and you say no development here. I don't care if it's the outskirts, okay? Second, you concentrate development into areas where mobility and transit are concentrated. A fantastic example of this, I want you all to look at this tomorrow. Go to the city of Curitiba in Brazil. You don't have to look for European cities. The answers are not all in Europe or US. Go to a city called Curitiba. In the 1970s, there was a very enlightened planner by the name of Jaime Lerner, who was the mayor of the city. And he was a planner. So what he did is the city was exploding. And instead of pressuring the city, he created five corridors around the city. And he put bus rapid transit in the middle of them and allowed high density to happen. So the point is, in a city like Delhi or whichever one, which is cooked, it's not a city which has too much land to explore. I'm not saying Delhi, I don't know Delhi. You look for areas, you look for conduits to concentrate development. And one of the greatest ways of concentrating development is along corridors, which means that before architecture comes, you have to prepare that corridor with all the robust transit that will now support that kind of development. So that's one. And the second question is, what can you do as a budding architect? Right? What you can do as a budding architect is recognize that all the answers do not come through architecture. Right? So you are in this wonderful school where you have planning and conservation and everything. All right? So try to take an eraser and blur the boundaries between your studios. Like hang out and talk to, you know what I'm trying to say, but blur these boundaries, because the best thing you can do for yourself, in my opinion, the best thing, and I did not have anyone to guide me when I was in architectural school either, but the bottom line is, if you're sitting among a group of architects and you can speak like a planner, and if you can sit among a group of planners and speak like an architect, I think you're getting somewhere. That's the answer to the question. But if you think of yourself as an architect with a capital A who's going to design the coolest buildings in the world, you will never have the answer to the question that you are asking. But it's a great question. Thank you for asking it.
Yes, sir. If there are any more questions, I think we can take a few more questions, if any. Any student or faculty who wishes to ask any. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I'll just unmute you.
Ma'am, you can unmute now, I think. No?
Yeah, finally. I think that's why most students also. Whoa, what an amazing morning. Thank you so much, Vinay. My question to you is, when you were growing up as an architect, and I know that you studied, what were your milestones to look beyond the capital A? And how do we get ourselves in these colleges where we actually attract the students and faculty to actually sign up for this capital A and then tell them don't sign up. This is not the way. What can and how do we change this? How do we institutionalize blurring of the boundaries?
That's
Even though,
yeah, a very difficult question. So I will say that I'm glad Poonam asked this question and nobody else, because I can speak freely on behalf of both of us. I feel, I'm saying this to all the students here, perhaps even the faculty, I feel like my friend Poonam and I and others, we're like a minority sitting in a little canoe in the ocean, trying to talk to each other about things. Well, there's a huge ocean liner in the river where there's a big party going on. And that's really how we feel sometimes. We do stuff that we believe. We do our little thing. We don't know. We do what we feel is right. But when we look around, things don't seem very convincing. They at least for some of us, it feels shockingly myopic. So I will say with a straight face that when I was an architecture student in India, the heroes of architecture of my generation in the 90s when I was studying were predictable heroes. They were wonderful, eloquent, foreign educated architects who were doing very nice work, all right? Nothing wrong with it. They were doing very nice work. But they didn't have all the answers. But their shadow was so big, these 3 or 4 or 5 people, when I look back, that everything else that was going on around that was good was not being looked at all. Everything they said was the golden word, and it still is. It shocks me. And this is a tradition. I mean, I find it appalling even today, the amount of Corbusier that is going on around, as if he's the only answer to all our questions. The fanship. I'm not saying Corbusier is not a great architect. He's a fantastic architect. But he does not have all the answers. He was a terrible urbanist. I can say that on the record. He was a wonderful architect, but he was a terrible urbanist, a terrible, terrible urbanist. But nobody talks about it. Nobody understands it. So this, I think, is a huge disconnect. So I went through a confused state where I had no clue, absolutely, talking about milestones, about what this whole thing meant. And it took me a very long time to uneducate myself, to figure out, to get out of this programming that come into my own. And the only thing I will confess is that when I came to the US, and Poonam, you were in Europe at that time, this was a very ripe time for all of us, because urbanism as an agenda was actually picking up. I think that we must be very grateful for, because what had happened across the West is the generation of modern architects who had achieved this fame were now being challenged by their own students. Someone like Charles Moore, Robert Venturi, Alan Jacobs, John Reps. These were all people who were saying, you guys were only talking of buildings. That's one side of the story. Alan Jacob wrote a book about streets in the 1980s. I mean, it was a path-breaking book. Nobody was talking about streets as important things. So I think that agenda began to pick up, thankfully. And I think we were right at that time. We were all studying right at that time where these things were happening. And I like to think that that was a very important milestone for me, and certainly for you also personally, in Europe particularly, because these became the seeds where some of us, at least me, began to feel that, it makes a lot of sense. It is not about buildings. It's not about abstraction alone. It's about many, many other things. And I think to me that was the aha moment where I began to say, it really doesn't matter what others say. This is what I believe, and this is what I must be sincere to. And that's the only thing I can tell you. And then I will acknowledge a few mentors that are important. You know, I don't have to take their names, but there have been 3 or 4 people in my life that, sort of just nudged you towards books and reading and the way they think. And I think all of this is part of the same agenda where there was a conscious, systematic, intellectual challenge to the programming that had gone around since the 1960s. And it was not easy to get out of it, because the biggest danger you were facing is that you were no longer part of the popular party. You were now being outcast as a, I want you all to know, Hassan Fatih, I know all of us know him now. Hassan Fatih, the first book on Hassan Fatih that was written by one of my professors. His name is James Steele. He was one of my profs. And he has told me the story of it's a very touching moment. Hassan Fatih, as you know, was an anti-modernist. He was one of the people who challenged the very foundations of modernism, right? Because he truly believed in vernacular and everything. He was 80 years old when his monograph came out. Think about that. For 80 years, he had been castigated, thrown around, outcast as a person that didn't matter. And this man was doing incredibly profound work. And all of a sudden, we worship him now because of the book, that one book, that little white book. He was 80 years old, and James Steele told me this story. He said, I took the drawings, I published the book, I brought it to him. He was 82 by the time the book came out. And we sat in the garden, and he looked at the book, and he cried. Because he finally said, at least the world will see what I was trying to do. So Jeffrey Bawa in Sri Lanka, same story. So these are people who, in my book, were not afraid to challenge the mainstream. They are true heroes. There are many others, but these are the people that gained global attention, so I'm taking their names. They were genuinely interested in pursuing their calling. Unlike many others who were essentially modernists and flirted around with modernism in various ways. But to me, these are the great heroes, along with many others. And if they had not been recognized, it would have been a tremendous tragedy for all of us. So the point I'm making is, there are many other such wonderful people who are doing extraordinary work. And there's one right there, right there in front of me. These people need to be, what I'm saying is these parallel efforts need to be excavated. And they need to be shown, they need to be talked about, and we need to hear them. That is the only way we can begin to change the agenda of what you're talking about. Change the heroes, and the agenda will change.
So before I let you go, a great answer, great pointers. I'd like you to, your choice of words, and especially the one which is excavation, is unique, even to me. I've not heard people talk about excavating ideas, and I'm really taken in by it, because that's something that we'll catch up later on. But for this gathering, I would like you, where does this come from, and what do you really mean, excavation?
By excavation. Well, I think that, I just spoke about it in the context of Hassan Fatih. I mean, when you think of, I actually, the best way I can answer the question, Poonam, you and I were doing this wonderful exchange when the Louis Kahn thing was going on a few weeks ago. And Poonam and I were talking back and forth over Facebook and WhatsApp. And we were both saying essentially the same thing, which is the following. When you think about a city like Paris, and you think of Baron Haussmann's efforts at creating this wonderful boulevard, Champs-Élysées, etc., that he was doing, wonderful stuff. Of course, in his own way, pretty destructive too. There was another pretty incredible human being by the name of Viollet-le-Duc, who many, I know Poonam knows that idea very well, who was preserving a lot of these buildings, right? And what you see in Paris today is the result of both these efforts. One hand, these utopian ideas of changing Paris, but the other, preservation and keeping the character of a place alive. And the point Poonam and I were making to each other is that when this Louis Kahn IIM thing happened, everyone all of a sudden, Louis Kahn came back into limelight. Of course, great architect. We love his buildings. I mean, they should never go down. Of course. I mean, we agree with that. But the tragedy is that there are so many other unsung, wonderful architects who have done wonderful buildings who will never have champions. And that's the tragedy. Now, why is that a tragedy? Because the reason some architects and some works have become so famous is because some person wrote about them and other scholars picked up on it and regurgitated it and went on and on and on and on. And before you know, it's the thing. I mean, I'll say this in another way. I went to Chandigarh 15 years after I graduated from architecture school. I had never been to Chandigarh. And, as a young student, I would sit and look at Corbusier's buildings and read what William Curtis and others would write about him. Wonderful stuff. Then I went to Chandigarh, and I'm standing there, I'm trying to take a picture of this assembly, and I can't because there's a barbed wire fence in front of it. But the books had never told me about the barbed wire fence. The books had only told me of the original idea that Corbusier had. What happened about its evolution, how the buildings had grown, how they had decayed or changed, nobody had told me. I think this is a problem. So when I say excavation, I don't just talk about excavating unsung, less known pieces. I'm talking of excavating realities that are hidden in the world of architecture because we manipulate the viewpoint that we show to the world. We show manicured images of architecture to the world. When was the last time you saw an architect, he or she, talk about their buildings as if it was a process in evolution? I think most architects enjoy showing their intention of a building. This is what I did. These are the brand new photographs of the building when it was built. Why are we afraid of showing a building of how it evolved 20 years later? Why are we afraid? A building grows, a place evolves. So excavation or scholarship is about bringing these kind of agendas out, I think. It's about investing time in creating, not creating, in finding new facts. That's the best way I can put it. Finding new facts that lie buried under popular opinion that now begin to inform us of who we are. And it can be about the past, it can be about the future, it shouldn't be biased. But scholarship is of the absolute importance in our field. Otherwise, it's an inconsequential idea. We're just going around like chickens with our heads cut off, in my opinion.
Thank you. And if there is no other question, one last question. Why India is looking at West and what can reverse this? Can it be reversed? What do you feel? Somebody who's left India and still connected, and your book on Asia, and yet you would know in every day today, it's all about aping the West.
I will quickly add to your questions. Wonderful talk, sir. I just want in what ma'am is saying in the context of Banaras, I just want your quick suggestions and other things in vice versa, that what we really need to look in the West in terms of the complex systems like in India, where we are dealing with a lot of complex layers, and you know that the kind of revitalization is happening and the kind of things they are doing in the internal core of, I don't know, apart from the political willfulness, what we really need to adopt as an architect, as a planner, for what kind of thinking and approach we really need to look forward, and what we don't have as a policy here. What do you find? What is the difference between the two contexts, in the Western context and in the Indian context, in such cases?
Well, it's a very, very long and difficult question. I think we can take another hour to answer it, but at the risk of extreme oversimplification, all right? Academics hate oversimplification, so I have to put that as an outset. Oversimplified answer. Here's what I will say. I think the first thing is to compare the West to the global South is itself a ridiculous proposition. I think that is a false comparison. It's like comparing an apple and an orange, or comparing an apple and a jackfruit. I mean, it is, they're two different entities, two different phenomenological entities that both have so much to teach each other. All right? Now, let me say it this way. I'm saying this on the bottom of my heart, all right? And I have no shame in saying this. Every time I return to India, there's a side of me that says, there is something I could not do, which is to practice in India. I'll speak about India because I've been asked about India, is an incredible thing. All right, let me just, I say this with absolutely folded hands to all of you. I have the greatest admiration for each of you who is practicing in India, because to practice in India takes a certain acumen. You have to be part of the ecology, part of the ecosystem. It's not easy. It's a wonderfully difficult thing. So to do good work in India, to do good change, I'm not talking about building, I'm talking to bring change in India. Incredible accomplishment. All right? So in that sense, being in the West, you become an audience to this phenomenon. It's like, my God, this happened. This is outstanding. This is truly wonderful. This is one. The reverse phenomenon happens when, you realize that there is always a side of the global South which will be indelibly connected to the West because of history. So there are colonial remnants, there are confluences that remain. The global travel is so common now. So there is always the aspiration for what? What is that aspiration about? I think the aspiration, at the risk of oversimplification, I think, is really, first of all, the transparency and the order. I think that we all crave, I feel, we all eventually crave the order that the West has, the kind of almost over-regulation that the West has, which I think we miss in certain aspects of the global South. What we in the West, and I shouldn't say we, because I perhaps am lurking somewhere in the middle, lost between these two worlds, but those of my friends who sort of espouse to the practice of the West, I've spoken to them, crave the spontaneous informality that is found in the global South. We are desperate for it. I mean, look at what we're doing here. You guys will laugh. We take parking lots on weekends and convert them into farmers' markets. It's ridiculous. I mean, farmers' markets were part of the tradition of the West everywhere. So what happened? What happened is we obliterated all of this in the West in the name of modernization. The price we paid for modernization was the destruction of all these beautiful ideas, and now we're craving them back. So we now live in a world where I feel the sort of reconciliation of this is first to remove the comparisons, all right? To at least from my point of view, to know that frankly we should be admiring what is going on that side of the world, because the challenges are colossal. The amount of it's daunting when you think about what planning means in the global South. It's absolutely incredible. You don't know where to start. And the second thing I will say, and this gives me enormous hope, is that this also gets into the Banaras question, is that I think we are coming to a point where we are transcending the Western influence. And here's why I'm saying this. I was educated in a British Indian school. All right, British Indian in the sense that the syllabus was British and we were taught Shakespeare's and all kinds of things. This is who I am. I mean, I can't ignore it. I grew up in a world where if you spoke good English, you were considered sophisticated. If you didn't speak very good English, you were less so. But I'm very proud to say today that is not the case. And that is fantastic, because I have seen so many wonderful places and programs and wonderful things where people speak the way they want to. It is indigenous. It is about that place. It is the way it is who you are. You may speak in Hindi. You may speak in whichever way. You may speak in a Hindi, English accent. It doesn't matter. It is of that place. and to speak it confidently, to wear it confidently, as beautifully as a sari or a kurta, just, it is who I am, is really, I think, the first step towards something wonderful. So I'm not saying we deny the West. The West gave us a lot. It connects us to the world. But I am very hopeful and optimistic that after generations of post-colonialism and going through everything post-colonialism taught us and made us go through, we're finally emerging and we're saying, we are our own thing. And what does this mean? This means that the magnets and the forces for transforming cities in South Asia, in Asia, will not be the instruments that we have inherited from the West. So in Banaras, for example, one of the strategies that we had come up with, this is the best answer I can give you architecturally, is we realized that the municipality of Banaras has a very difficult time keeping the city clean. Think about it. My parents came to visit me in Banaras when I was there. They wanted to go to the Vishwanath temple. My mother came and said to me, a beautiful temple, but my God, the surroundings are so dirty. Right? And it's true. Why would you have such dirty surroundings? Why would you do that? Okay. Well, the municipality, I met with the municipal commissioner. We were doing this investigation, and it's very difficult. It's like, now, if you look at the temple of Tirupati, the Tirumala, one of the richest temples in India, I don't know if you know this. What they have done is actually the entire territory of Tirumala is a trust. It's not a municipality, it's a trust, which means that they have jurisdictional authority over the entire radius, and they can do the way they want. So they have legal rights of keeping their surroundings clean for whatever interest they want, whether it's religious, commercial, whatever it is. So one of the things we said in Banaras is, well, forget the municipality, let them do what they want to do. If each temple in Banaras was given jurisdiction over its own little quarter, whatever, feet or kilometers, whatever, and now they are responsible for keeping their surroundings clean, you would immediately have, perhaps, hypothetically, a very different city. Because for commercial interests, because we realize temples are commercial entities, they're economic entities. Even the people sitting outside weaving garlands in Banaras pay a little commission to the temple. They have an understanding. So it's a system. So if you now absorb the linchpins and say, these are the transformational sort of characteristics, not some zoning, not some municipality, you can begin to find very interesting ways of doing things. This is already happening in India. So many wonderful transformations are happening in India magically. And this is the other thing I want to tell the students today. From a distance, from where I see it, there are outstanding, amazing things happening in India. Cities are being magically cleaned. All you have to do is go to Facebook and take a look every day on Instagram. Some incredible thing happened where some orchards were created somewhere. Someone restored some mangroves. All of this is happening. What you all need to do is excavate this. Bring them into limelight, write about it, make people know that these wonderful things are happening. Because it is the only way that you can truly celebrate the wonderful things that are going on. If you don't do that, then what's going to happen is everything that is popular is going to cast its shadow on this, and nobody is going to know these alternative practices that are truly indigenous, because they are stemming from the actual realities of how India and other places work. It seems to me. I really urge you to do it, and I want to invite you all to contribute to My Livable City, because it's a magazine. It's a simple magazine where we try to disseminate knowledge to everyone. So if you have a wonderful idea to write about cities on themes that are meaningful, please, through Poonam and others, please do consider be part of the team, and we welcome it.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Vinayakji. This is Meenakshi Jain. I was trying to unmute myself, but I could not earlier. I'm really very, very wonderful and very inclusive lecture. I'm sure this will go a long learning for the students, and really a thought process has already been generated, how to blur, how to combine the different fields, be it urban design, be it the conservation, be it the landscape. everything in one and taking the examples from the north, east, north, south, everywhere. I mean, really, truly, I'm grateful to you for such a wonderful, enlightening session. And I'm sure in future also, we'll just request Poonamji also to put us, when the students are here in the campus, and probably you also visit India, you said in Chandigarh sometimes, and please visit us too. It is really heartening to listen to you today, and in future also we look forward similar kind of contribution. And this is Meenakshi Jain. I'm the director of SP Vijayawada, and I was silently listening to every aspect of it and noting down. Believe me, I mean, it's really wonderful to hear you. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a great honor, and again,
Thank you so
thank you to
much.
Poonam, and thank you to you. And again, I will do this as namaste because this is not a gesture. I think this the meaning of this gesture, as I'm told, is the light in me sees the light in all of you. So we should not say goodbye in a Western way, we should say goodbye in an Indian way. So thank you for this, and it's really a great pleasure to be here. And thank you, Poonam, again,
And I would like
being
to,
such a
yeah,
great friend.
and my thanks to the SPAV for being so receptive and supporting this kind of, so that we can bring certain different ideas. And this is also very important, I think, the voices that are making different sounds and giving us a different route to look beyond, so that we ourselves can find our own voices which may be different from the masses. And so, thank you, Dr. Meenakshi and Dr. Janmajoy, dear Sanjay, and everyone, all students.
Thank
And
you.
I'll request Poonamji to all the students, they should please join this wonderful series, knowledge series, and it will really go a long way because but they are experimenting. I believe as an architect or planner, you have your own role. And as Vinayakji told us today, that each and every person in the city becomes very, very important entity, and we have to respect every core of it, be it cultural especially, and the indigenous traditional knowledge is immense in India, and accordingly start designing how to, I mean, not only talking about the buildings, talk about the streets, talk about their siting, site plan, and every context, within the site, outside the site, everything is to be really taken a great care. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
It was indeed a very informative and fruitful session that has left us all with various thoughts to ponder upon.
Exactly.
I would like to thank Professor Vinayak Bharne, sir, for taking out time and enlightening us with this engaging session on the topic Heritage Conservation and Urbanism, Notes from 2 Decades of Practice. I would also like to thank Architect Poonam Verma ma'am, Senate member of SPA Vijayawada, for curating such a thought-provoking series of special lectures for all of us. I also extend my thanks to our Honorable Director of SPA Vijayawada, Professor Dr. Meenakshi Jain ma'am, for her immense support and cooperation throughout. I would also like to extend my thanks to Dr. Janmajoy Gupta sir, Head of Department Architecture, for his support. Thank you to one and all faculties and students for your precious time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.